Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the after lunch session. I'm going to kick things off before a very exciting panel. So I want to talk to you a little bit about supply chains and critical minerals, critical energy infrastructure. And to do that, we really need to talk about technology innovation. And it's an interesting phenomenon, because to innovate technology takes time, and it takes time to develop, it takes time to perfect, and then it takes even more time to commercialize. And along the road, it's pretty bumpy. There's lots of twists and turns, and there's usually lots of voices while you're doing it that tell you it can't be done. And we've certainly seen that at E3. And when you look at the world as a global ecosystem, and you think about the technology innovation and who does what best, you can't look very far to see China and their ability to scale and manufacture products. They're absolutely fantastic at it. And a good example is the electric vehicle. So rewind 15 years, okay? 2009. Tesla just developed the Roadster. It is in its infancy. The company is going through financial difficulties. At the same time, China decides to go all in on EVs. Between 2009 and 2022, $29 billion invested into the EV infrastructure. And at the same time, we went from 100,000 EVs on the road in 2009 to 26 million in 2022. And in just 1 year after that, at the end of 2023, 40 million EVs on the road. And just couple months ago, 1.4 million EVs sold in a single month. This equates to about a 50 to 60% annual rate of growth. It's absolutely massive. And so when you think about this ecosystem, you look at why we're doing this, I like to think about from the reason that I got into lithium. So it's been a while since I've been in university, and there's been a couple things that have stuck with me since those days. And one of them specifically spawned my desire to get into the development of lithium. And it was actually just an offhanded comment made by a professor. This is circa 2001. This is before the commercialization of lithium-ion batteries. They were a thing, we knew about them, but they weren't in anything commercial really very much at that point. And he said that the roadblock to going to an electrified future is truly the ability to move electrons around in a mobile sense, that being a highly efficient battery. And we now have that battery in the form of a lithium ion. And so that change has been pretty dramatic. When we look at the shift to electrification, a lot of the times we think about it as a movement towards a sustainable future. And while that is true, and still the majority of the discussion, there's a dominant force that we're seeing more and more in the background that is guiding this direction, and that is the energy independence conversation. So China makes great products. They're supplying the world right now with these products. And it's not just batteries and cars, it's solar panels. It's all of the things that we need in our life to electrify. So why the rhetoric? Why do we hear China bad more and more in the news these days? Especially considering how we have, in the Western world, has prospered and been happy to buy products out of China for the past 40 years. I think this is worth digging into a little bit. And so let's start with energy independence. We've talked about this a little bit on the stage already today, but there's no such thing as a low energy rich country. So this graph shows GDP per capita versus energy consumption per capita. And what it's highlighting here, this isn't my graph, what's highlighting here is that gap of where a country that would have a wealth with no energy just does not exist in this world. And every country knows this. This is a very powerful understanding. So let's dig into this a little bit. Let's talk about electricity. Currently today, China produces 3 terawatts of electricity, and they're looking at expanding that to nearly 9. Just think about the scale of that expansion. It's not obviously happening very quickly, but that is their goal. 1.2 terawatts of that expansion is planned to be renewables. And they're innovating in the nuclear space. They have these new Gen 4 reactors, these falling bead reactors, that have claims that they can never go critical. So when you look at that and you compare it to another big economy, the United States, 1.3 terawatts of power consumption relative to China's current 9 or 3, and they're looking at scaling another half a terawatt. So we're talking about somewhere just under 2. And then you look at Canada, we're more of a drop in the bucket. We're closer to about 0.6 terawatts or 600 gigs. So the same analogy can be said to the EV and battery industry. Right after this talk, we're going to sit down on a panel. We're going to talk about this with some very smart people, and one of whom is the former CTO, Chief Technology Officer of CATL. CATL is a very good example. They are leading the charge right now in terms of battery technology and their innovations that they're going forward. And Bob's going to talk about this on the panel discussion that we're going to have, is the innovation that CATL has had. They've only been around for 14 years. So almost 14 years. They are a very new company in this space. Yet they still produce most of the batteries, or they're the biggest battery company producer in the world. And so when we look at the stats for EVs, we can dig into this a little bit. 80% of batteries produced in China today. 60% of electric vehicles produced in China today. And a lot of that they're exporting to the broader world. The consumption in China is that most of these vehicles are now being exported. If you look at lithium, which is the space that I reside in, the same is also true. China does not mine a lot of lithium. Most of the mining, half of the world's lithium molecules are being mined in Australia today, in the outback. Another big jurisdiction is the traditional evaporation ponds of South America. But what China does is they refine it. So if you want a lithium salt, a carbonate or hydroxide that goes into your battery, 70 to 80% of that's coming out of China today. So when we look at this and we have these conversations, when I actually sat down to put this talk together for Graham and for the conference, I didn't necessarily want to talk that much about the Asian side of this equation. But it's impossible to look at what's happening in the world without referring to it, because it's a driving force. And so why then is the CEO of a Calgary-based lithium company here talking about energy security and energy independence? It's because first of all, I actually can wear a suit. When Graham doesn't say I can dress down, I actually can put on a suit and tie. One of the things that happened in the last 4 or 5 years is that we put the word critical in front of mineral. And when we did that, the conversation changed dramatically. Certain minerals, especially lithium, have been deemed critical. And what that means is that we get roped into the conversation, and we've been asked to provide expertise in terms of our ability to be able to provide this to the Western world. And the summary of this is that the world is truly changing. We've talked about it today on some of the other panels and some other aspects, but I'm just going to focus on this particular aspect, which is we've been buying products out of China for 40 years, and it has kept inflation low, because we've been able to buy products that we couldn't produce for the same price here in North America and in Europe. But it seems now that the powers that be, and I'm not on either side of this equation, I'm just living in the ecosystem, the powers that be have decided that some of these critical items that we buy out of China is a bridge too far. It's the same reason that Taiwan gets brought into the conversation. And the West is trying to catch up. Because right now, the best batteries are manufactured by China. The best chips and semiconductors by Taiwan. So batteries have become this integral part of the energy mix. As we try to transition to electrification, you need the battery, and the pace at which you can scale to an electrified future is highly dependent on your access to batteries, and therefore to the critical minerals and materials that go into these batteries, and your ability to produce them, or at least buy them from a nation that you might deem as friendly. And this transition is not going to happen overnight. So a question that we raise is, should we even compete with China in this aspect? I mean, they already have the ecosystem, they already have the supply chain to make the current battery chemistries, which are dominated by, right now, LFP and NCM, and then there's some new technologies that are coming out of Panasonic, which are pretty exciting. So should we compete in North America? And the answer to that is, well, given the society that we have, we told ourselves at being very good at innovating. So can we innovate our way out of this challenge? And to bring that home a little bit, I personally believe that the best and cheapest way to make a battery is at the back of the lithium source, where you make the lithium. And there's lots of reasons for that. But when you look at the world and where lithium is produced, it's the Atacama Desert, it's the outback of Australia. They simply don't have the infrastructure that gives you the ability to build these batteries at the back of the lithium source. But we do in Alberta. And if you want to know more about this, you can grab me after the show, and I'm happy to talk your ear off about how we can do this. But again, when we look at what's actually happening in the race to electrify, I really like using the landline analogy. What happened as developing nations industrialized in recent years is that they skipped the landline. They wanted mobile. They wanted the ability to communicate. And if you're my age or older, and maybe some of you still have a landline in your house, you remember fighting over that phone, connected to a wall, connected to a wire, connected to a transfer station, so you could make a phone call and communicate with the world. Developing nations that are industrializing have skipped that, and they went right to building mobile towers. And there are people in this world that never knew the concept of a phone connected to a wall. And the same is happening for electric vehicles. With the mass export of Chinese electric vehicles and us protectionism blocking them from coming into the Western world, they're going to all these developing nations. And so people are buying electric cars. But when you look at what's happening, there are people in this world who will never know the joy of going to a gas pump and filling up a car with gasoline because they've skipped them. Developing nations are skipping the gas-powered car. So there's a massive push then from the Western world to compete. Again, this is just observational, but batteries and electric vehicles are not alone. We talked about chips and a myriad of other pieces of technology that we need for electrification and digital lives that are not manufactured within friendly nations that we're trying to bring back. And it's absolutely huge. And we talk about this from the lens of, and you probably heard catchphrases like onshoring, friendshoring, nearshoring. And while they may seem a little bit of like whispers from the lens we have here in Alberta, rest assured that there's huge forces behind these in the rest of the world, pushing very hard to bring this infrastructure into friendly nations. And so when you look at the example that Canada has, we've incentivized multinational corporations to bring battery manufacturing, electric vehicle manufacturing to Canada. This is a competition against the IRA. So this onshoring of things from Canada, and whether or not you appreciate the incentives, whether or not I think the incentives that the Canadian governments provide are good or bad, the reality is that there is a cost to bringing this manufacturing into Canada, and that is it's inflationary. It will cost us more money to make these materials in Canada than we could buy them elsewhere. And because this is a competition with the IRA, maybe we can talk a little bit about the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. I'm not an expert in this legislation by a long stretch. But from the EV battery lens, there are two main components. One is subsidies, $7,500. If your vehicle is made without Chinese components, you can give a subsidy paid for by the government to your consumer to buy that car for cheaper. The other is what's happening behind the scenes. And if you're in the ecosystem, you'll see a lot of announcements as of late of the United States government funding battery companies, EV companies, mining companies to develop the ecosystem to bring battery manufacturing onshore. And it's a bit hilarious that they've called it the Inflation Reduction Act when all of this is actually going to cause inflation. The other thing that the United States has done, and all countries in the Western world, are tariffing Chinese cars. So you would have heard as of late, the United States, and then quickly followed by Canada, increased the tariff on Chinese cars to 100%. 100% Chinese tariffs on cars. And the question you have to ask yourself is that actually the right path to the outcome that we're trying to get here, which is that we're trying to electrify transport? That's the goal of these nations right now. And what the real story is that there's a missing car segment. The gap in the availability of the $20,000 to $40,000 car with decent range does not exist from the North American Western automakers as of today. Of course, it's coming, but right now, we don't have it available. And imagine if we did. Imagine if these cars were available for these prices. Now, these are in euros, but the translation in Canada is about Canadian dollars, about 1.6, 1.7. You're in the range of that $20,000 to $40,000 Canadian car, and you're getting very decent range. If we had these cars available on the market today, imagine the infrastructure. Imagine people buying them. The adoption would happen quicker, infrastructure would be put in faster, and the adoption to electrification that we're trying to push so hard for would happen that much faster. Of course, we are going to catch up in North America. We are building these facilities right now. There's a lot of infrastructure being constructed. We talked about the Canadian side of things. Those plants are being built today. We're building battery factories. We're retooling lines in the automobile plants to produce electric cars. And when you look at that side of the segment and you look at what could happen if you had these vehicles in faster adoption. And so maybe we'll innovate our way out of this. Maybe we'll find new technologies to produce better batteries that'll help us compete. And imagine if you could buy a train car full of cells, highly efficient cells, and you're a new startup company and you needed a good source of electricity, you could use these cells. Imagine the innovation that would come if you had a readily available, cheap electricity that you could move around mobily. And that is coming. So when we look around at, as I wrap this up and we look around at the world and the strife that we see that are bigger than this conversation, the changes that are happening in the world, and this is true at all times, but I think it's worth the lens. The changes that we see happening today are obviously going to affect us into the future. The question is, how do we want to shape the future? What do we want it to look like? How do we remain competitive? And how does the Western world remain relevant when the world seems moving past us? So I'm going to leave you with 4 questions to think about as you go through the talks today, because as this is a TED-style talk, we don't answer any questions on these talks. We just pose them to you guys to think about. So in the spirit of that, I have 4 questions for you guys to think about through the next couple of days, and then when you get back to your regular lives. How important is it that Canada and the US is able to produce batteries in-country, creating a full cradle-to-grave electric supply chain, to be self-reliant, buying these things instead of buying these things from China? Is slowing down the EV adoption for protectionism reasons worth falling behind the rest of the world? And I look at this from the lens of a comment made by the CEO of Stellantis. If you don't know who Stellantis is, they're one of the bigger automobile companies, and they're a conglomerate of a bunch of different brands. Chrysler, Jeep, Dodge is the North American, Fiat. They're a huge conglomerate. And the CEO came out and said that he doesn't agree that tariffing Chinese cars is the answer. And his justification was that it makes Western automobile companies less competitive. Are we ready for more inflation to onshore the critical pieces of our supply chain? And last and not least, can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we build our own supply chains, build it sustainably, and still afford to buy the products that we make? Is our ability to innovate going to save us from ourselves? Thank you very much.